When the whole town turned their backs on a wounded Apache woman, one quiet rancher stepped forward and changed both their destinies. Their story isn't just about survival, it's about seeing worth where others saw none. Like, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, your city and country. Let's get started. Texas, 1883. The auction yard baked beneath a ruthless sun, turning dust into a shimmering haze that clung to boots and throats alike. Voices rose in a harsh chorus of bidding, metal chains rattling as men dragged their purchases away. Only one figure remained untouched on the wooden platform, an Apache woman named Asha. She stood tall, despite the bruises shadowing her skin, her wrists raw from ropes, her breath shallow but unbroken. The crowd's interest had long since shifted elsewhere, leaving her isolated under the weight of 100 indifferent eyes. Daniel Hayes leaned against a weathered fence post, arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. Ranchers and traders haggled like vultures circling scraps, but Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the woman no one chose. He had seen cruelty before, on cattle drives, in border skirmishes, in ranch hands desperate enough to turn on each other. Yet something in her refusal to lower her chin, even as jeers surrounded her, stirred a quiet ache inside him. She was exhausted, but not defeated. Hurt, but not hollow. There was fire there still. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his brow, his voice growing impatient. "Unsold. Last call. Somebody take the girl so we can close this out." His words cracked through the silence like a whip. Asha's eyes flickered, but she didn't plead. She didn't beg for mercy. She simply waited for whatever came next, whether it was abandonment or another beating, with the eerie calm of someone who had survived too much to fear anything else. The crowd muttered, uninterested. No one stepped forward. Not one man claimed her. Daniel pushed himself off the post slowly, almost against his own will. He hadn't come to buy anyone. He'd come for grain, nails, maybe a new saddle if he found a decent price. Yet his boots carried him toward the platform as if the desert wind itself guided his steps. Asha saw him approach, her gaze steady and unreadable. She expected nothing from him, not pity, not rescue, not another cruel hand, just another outcome she would endure. "I'll take her," Daniel said quietly. The auctioneer blinked, surprised anyone still cared. "You sure?" he asked, lowering his voice. "She ain't trained. Wild. Trouble follows these ones." Daniel nodded once. "I said I'll take her." No applause, no murmurs of admiration. Only silence as coins changed hands. It wasn't about ownership. He didn't want a servant. He wanted to keep her from disappearing into whatever fate awaited the forgotten and unwanted. A sentence disguised as mercy. Asha's breath hitched, barely visible, like a candle flickering in wind. She wasn't sure what had just happened, rescue or a quieter kind of captivity. When he extended a hand, she hesitated. His palm was rough, calloused, sun-worn, but still held gentle intent. Slowly, with the wary caution of a wild creature unsure if the trap had teeth, she placed her bound hands into his. Daniel didn't drag her. He didn't shove or tighten his grip. He simply helped her step down from the platform as if she was someone who mattered. The crowd dispersed, uninterested in their departure. Daniel led her toward his wagon, pausing to cut the rope around her wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving angry red marks behind. She flinched when he touched her arm, and he immediately stepped back. "You're free to walk," he said softly. "I won't harm you." Asha studied him carefully, her dark eyes searching for the lie hidden in those words. But she found no greed, no hunger, no threat, only a quiet man carrying more sorrow than he ever admitted aloud. The wagon ride was silent, except for the creaking wheels and the restless call of distant coyotes. Asha kept her gaze fixed on the plains, watching the horizon stretch wide and unending. Daniel didn't push her to speak. He didn't ask her past, her tribe, her scars. He simply drove the wagon with steady hands, giving her space to breathe. Occasionally he offered water, placing the canteen beside her rather than handing it directly, letting her choose whether to take it. She watched him, analyzing every small gesture like a woman learning a new language. By the time they reached his ranch, the sky had dipped into a golden hush. The land was quiet, dotted with grazing cattle and open fields touched by evening light. Daniel hopped down and gestured toward the cabin. "This is home," he said awkwardly, realizing too late how strange the word sounded. Asha didn't step down at first. She studied the place, the worn steps, the lantern on the post, the smoke curling from the chimney. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a cage. It was something in between. A place she wasn't sure she deserved. When she finally stepped onto the ground, her legs nearly buckled. Daniel reached instinctively to steady her, but she recoiled, tightening her jaw. "Sorry," he murmured, lowering his hands. "I won't touch you unless you ask." The promise hung in the air, fragile and unfamiliar. Asha swallowed hard, not from fear, but from confusion. She had known cruelty, neglect, and loss. Kindness was the strange thing. Kindness felt dangerous. Kindness felt like a trick. But he didn't push. He simply walked ahead and left the cabin door open for her. Inside, warmth from the fireplace washed over the room. Daniel placed a blanket on the table and stepped aside. "You can stay in here. I'll sleep in the barn if that's easier." Asha blinked, startled. He was offering safety, choice, privacy. She touched the blanket lightly, tracing the woven threads as if they were something sacred. For a moment she allowed herself to breathe fully, the fear easing from her shoulders piece by piece. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first step towards something she had lost long ago. Belief in her own worth. Daniel watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, unsure of what to say. "You're not a prisoner," he said softly. "You're not here to serve me. I just didn't want to see you left there." Asha finally looked at him, truly looked, and found a man carrying more loneliness than she did. A man who didn't want ownership, only to do what felt right in a world that rarely was. In the quiet of that moment, something unspoken settled between them. Not trust yet, not affection, but the fragile beginning of a bond that might become both. That night, as the Texas wind whispered against the cabin walls, Asha lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, she wasn't chained, beaten, or hunted. She was simply alive, in the care of a stranger who looked at her without hunger or cruelty. Daniel slept in the barn, unaware that his small act of mercy had shifted the course of both their lives. Asha closed her eyes slowly, letting exhaustion win. And in the soft glow of the dying fire, she allowed a single thought she had abandoned long ago. Maybe tomorrow would not bring pain. Daniel didn't chain her when they reached the ranch. He simply opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The old cabin smelled of cedar smoke and worn leather, a quiet place untouched by cruelty. Asha stood rigid, waiting for the command she expected any moment. But Daniel only placed a blanket near the hearth and said, "Rest if you'd like." His voice carried no force, no threat, only a gentle offering. She didn't understand him fully, but she understood one thing. This man wasn't treating her like property, and that terrified her even more. The first nights were silent. Asha slept lightly, flinching at every creak of the wooden floorboards. She kept her back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting someone else to barge in. Daniel never crossed the room after sunset. He simply lit a lantern outside her door and left her alone. She didn't know why that single flame steadied her heartbeat. Maybe because in the camps, darkness meant danger. Here, the light meant someone cared enough to keep watch. Slowly, her breaths deepened, her nightmares softened, and her trembling began to fade. During the day, she moved like a shadow, silent, quick, and alert. Daniel noticed she never touched the food until he stepped away from the table. So he began leaving meals on a counter instead of handing them to her. He spoke little, letting her shape her own space within his home. Asher watched him from corners and doorways, puzzled by his quietness. Men she'd seen spoke with fists, commands, and raised voices. But Daniel was different. He worked with simple rhythm: feed the horses, mend, a fence, water the crops, never once demanding her obedience. One afternoon she approached him while he sanded down a broken fence post. Her steps were hesitant, but she carried the empty water bucket. Without speaking, she set it down beside him. Daniel paused, met her cautious eyes, and nodded softly. And, "Thank you." It wasn't the words she understood. It was the softness. That day, for the first time, she worked beside him. She handed him tools. He gave her space. Dust clung to her braids, sweat glistened on her skin, but she didn't feel like a slave. She felt strangely free, a freedom she feared might disappear. At night, the hearth became their quiet meeting ground. Sasha would sit near the flames, warming hands that once trembled from cold and fear. Daniel sat across the room, repairing tack or reading old ranch ledgers. They didn't speak, yet the silence grew comfortable, even safe. She found herself studying the lines on his face, the quiet sorrow in his eyes, the lonely curve of his smile. He was a man hurt by life too, she realized. Not cruel, just tired. And she wondered if the world had left him alone, just as it had abandoned her. When the first storm of the season arrived, thunder cracked like gunfire. Asher leapt from her bed, heart racing, body remembering the raids, the cages, the chains. Daniel heard her gasp and rushed from his room, stopping several steps away so he wouldn't startle her. "It's just a storm," he said gently, mimicking rain with his hand. She shook violently, unable to trust the sky's fury. So Daniel lit the lantern outside her door again and sat on the porch for hours, letting her see he wasn't leaving. That night, she slept sitting up. But she slept. Days passed, and Asha's fear began to shift into watchfulness. She cleaned the cabin out of instinct, arranged tools, swept floors. She tended the horses, who responded to her in ways Daniel had never seen. She whispered to them in her native tongue. They nudged her hair, sensing her gentle spirit. Daniel watched from a distance, struck by the quiet grace she carried, even after so much loss. She wasn't a slave. She wasn't broken. She was surviving in a world that had tried to erase her, and he felt honored simply to witness her strength. One evening, Asha approached Daniel as he repaired a saddle strap. Her voice, unused for so long, trembled as she asked her first question. "Why choose me?" Daniel set the strap down, surprised by the depth in her eyes that carried deserts, storms, and stories. He answered softly, "Because you were the only one they didn't see." She didn't know every word, but she felt the truth in his tone. No one had ever chosen her for anything except punishment or control. Yet he had chosen her simply because he saw her as human. That changed everything. As weeks passed, their lives intertwined without force. Asha began cooking simple meals. Daniel learned a few Apache words to thank her. She smiled for the first time, small, soft, cautious, but real. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, something warm he hadn't known in years. But he kept his distance, never touching her, never assuming anything. Respect grew between them like wildflowers after rain, fragile yet unstoppable. Asha found herself waiting for his footsteps each morning, listening for his laugh when a horse acted stubborn, watching his hands with quiet appreciation. The turning point came at sunset. Asha was gathering firewood when she heard horse hooves approaching fast, too fast. Fear froze her. Raiders rode like that. Slave hunters rode like that. But Daniel stepped outside first, placing himself between her and the approaching riders. 3 men halted at the fence, eyes lingering on Asha with cruel curiosity. "You bought one of them Apache girls," one sneered. "Heard they fetch good money." Daniel's voice hardened. "She isn't for sale." The men laughed, muttered threats, and rode off. Asher stared at him, stunned. Someone had protected her, without ownership. That night she couldn't sleep. She stepped outside, where Daniel sat carving a small wooden horse. Slowly, she sat across from him. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Why protect me?" Daniel looked at her, lantern light soft on his face. "Because you deserve a life that belongs to you." Tears filled Asher's eyes. She turned away, unused to being valued. Those words broke something open in her. Not pain, but release. For the first time, she believed she could build a life not shaped by fear, and Daniel knew he would give her all the time she needed. Spring came early that year. Wildflowers painted the fields, and Asher began humming again, soft melodies from her childhood. Daniel heard them from across the ranch and smiled at the sound. When she cooked, she prepared enough for both of them. When he worked, she worked beside him. No promises had been spoken, yet something unspoken bound them. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills, Asher handed him a small woven charm, a symbol of gratitude in her tribe. Daniel held it like something fragile. "Thank you," he whispered. Asher smiled. "For saving me." But she shook her head, touching her chest. "No, you saved my spirit." Daniel felt his breath catch. In that moment, without needing more words, he understood what had been growing between them. Not obligation, not debt, but love shaped by gentleness, by patience, by two broken souls learning to breathe again. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. Instead, she placed her hand in his, warm, trusting, unafraid. The storm inside her had finally quieted, and the loneliness inside him finally lifted. Together, they found something neither had expected: hope. Months later, the townsfolk spoke of the strange couple, the quiet rancher and the rescued Apache woman who moved with the grace of the desert wind. Some whispered, some judged, but most learned to respect the bond they shared, a bond forged not by force, but by choice. When Daniel and Asher finally exchanged vows beside the river, it was simple. No crowd, no ceremony, just two hearts promising to walk the same path. Asher placed the woven charm around his wrist. Daniel placed his hand over hers. Under the setting sun, they chose each other freely. Asher stood on the porch that evening, watching the sky turn amber. Once, she had been the woman nobody wanted, sold, forgotten, left on an auction block like discarded goods. Now, she stood beside a man who saw her worth long before she saw it herself. Daniel brought a second chair outside and sat beside her. No words were needed. Their hands brushed, fingers intertwining naturally. Two lives scarred by the world had found a home not in walls or land, but in each other. And in the quiet embrace of that Texas sunset, their story truly began.